Just people join, they'll be able to get to us, or they're right to operate. You just open it up, press submit, somebody can join and pay it. Everything else should be good to go.
Okay, thank you very much. Are we ready to go?
We are. Welcome, Paulina.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So this is another series of the workshops of the district plan. We're gonna talk about a really interesting and contentious topic today. We're gonna cover medium density and high density residential zones. This is one of the most important things for the future in terms of strategic direction to cater for growth of the city. So you know that we have done a lot of work in the developing a native spatial picture. We have done structure planning. We have worked on the future development strategy, and all of that has been reflected in our proposed district plan chapters, which is the medium density and high density. So today the presentation is going to be run by our very reliable friends here from Barker and Associates, Rachel and Lily. They have been part of this journey for a long time, and they're going to tell us about what the recommendations are in terms of the submission for those areas. So yes, I would like to either you can talk from there or come and join me here.
Should we go?
Should just go? Oh, perfect. Okay. Oh, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here today. As Paulina mentioned, we're really keen to take you through our initial thinking on the medium and high density residential zones and potential changes to those zones arising from submissions on the proposed district plan. And we're really keen to get your direction today on that early thinking on the options so that can inform our work going forward over the next few months. So then just going forward to the next slide. So Paulina will talk in a moment to some of the process and time frame issues for the hearing, which will be relevant. And there's a few topics there that have been split out, which will be relevant to this discussion. I'll very quickly recap on the notified zoning and the approach to residential. I know you'll all be pretty familiar with it, but very briefly recap on that. Talk about some of the issues raised in submissions and some of the key changes that we're looking at to address those issues that are raised. And then finally with some discussion with yourselves and direction. But firstly to process and timelines.
Yeah, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. You know that we're busy now preparing the hearings report, what we call the Section 42 reports. We're going to get into hearings in the early November, and the hearings will go pretty much a hearing per month until probably July next year. So that's they have been a long journey that you're very familiar with. And in terms of the hearing timelines relevant to this topic today, so we're looking at May next year to talk about the medium density and high density residential zones. So there's quite a lot of work for us to actually get ready for that hearing. And this is the first step discussing with you about what do you want to go about those feedback that we receive. Once we have that direction, the planners can go and do the analysis and further work that we're probably going to need before we finalize those Section 42 reports. So May is when we do that. And also there's quite a bit of synergy with the rezoning hearings that are going to happen in June next year as well. So those are the two areas that I highlighted there.
So then just picking up on that split between what we're going to talk about today versus the rezoning. So,
Sorry, just a question here.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, just wanting to check if, like, we're potential commissioners, is there anything that we need to be careful about in this workshop?
Yeah, I mean, that's you're right. You need to, you've been part of the journey. I see that's really, before we get to the hearing, you're still providing the direction as councillors.
Okay.
So I don't think that is there is any conflicts at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for asking, though.
okay, so just going back to the distinction between what we're going to talk about today versus the rezoning. So today we're really going to be talking about the zones and the level of development that the zone rules broadly enable. We won't necessarily be getting into where and how those zones have been applied. That will be something to pick up a little bit later on as part of that rezoning, topic. And Fleur is on the line. I know you're there, Fleur. She's taking the lead on that rezoning topic, so she can certainly hear that discussion today. But that will be something to take you through at a later workshop. But there is a lot of relationship between those two topics, so yeah, any and all discussion welcome on that today. So it's firstly, how did we get here? And you'll all be pretty familiar with this. So it started off with the Napier Spatial Picture in 2022, and that was really that collation of Napier's existing strategies and plans, and a key part of that work was doing that accessibility analysis and really setting out that intensification strategy within Napier's urban area. That then flowed down through to the high-level structure plans, which were completed last year, and that was really getting into that next level of detail around where the heights and densities to be enabled and where those medium and high density zones would apply at a more fine-grained level. And those high-level structure plans really were the key document that informed the zoning extents and the rules that were proposed in the notified plan. So then moving through to the next slide. So in response to that, those new residential zones were introduced. So what we're focusing on today is the high and medium density residential zone. But it also included the general residential zone and the large lot zone as well. And not forgetting that high density residential is also enabled within the commercial areas. So that's the city centre and the mixed use zone, as well as the town and local centres above ground floor level. And then just moving through to the next slide. So this is an illustration, thank you. This is an illustration from the high-level structure plans, and it's really just giving you a sense and a bit of a reminder really of the heights and densities that the PDP enables within each of those zones. So the high density residential zone is broadly enabling about 6 stories or up to 6 stories, 19.5 metres. And within the medium density residential zone, it's up to 3 stories or 11 to 12 metres. That obviously sits within a broader spectrum. So within the city centre zone, heights and densities are greater than that again at about 8 stories or 32 metres. And then that transitions down to the general residential zone, which is around about 2 stories. Then just moving through to the next slide.
Yeah, just before, can I just say, this is a really, really important part of the submission, so that people, when they see these heights, they get very frightened about the potential environmental effects of that height. It's hard to realize that this would happen obviously gradually. Yeah. We are trying to put that high story buildings in the places that should go within close proximity of city centers, etc. It's not something that's going to happen randomly in neighborhoods all of a sudden. But yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty, and that poses a lot of questions about the height that we are enabling.
Mm. Yeah, and that's a really good point. The provisions as they're drafted in the notified plan are enabling. So in the high density residential zone, for example, it's enabled up to 6 stories, but what will likely be delivered and what we see in other cities in New Zealand is you do get a broad range of development types being delivered depending on the size of the site, what the developer wants to deliver and what the market is demanding. So it's not necessarily all apartments. It can be a house put on the back. It could be a terraced housing development or a duplex or any combination of those things. So I'm not going to go through this line by line, but we can certainly come back to this if we need to. It's really just a quick and easy comparison of the standards that are proposed in each of the residential zones. And you can really just see there the key difference on this slide between the zones is the height that's enabled and the recession planes or height in relation to boundary, if that term is more familiar to you. So we've talked about the heights. But in terms of the recession planes, they are a key driver of how much development you can achieve on a site, and this will become evident as we get through the presentation. So in the high density zone, what was notified was a very enabling recession plane, which would enable up to 6 stories on most sites where the zone is applied. And the same with the medium density and the general residential. But the high density zone, that'll be something we come back to later in the presentation. And then just moving through to the next slide there, I think the key difference on this slide, and I'll talk about the red ones in a moment, is the outlook space standard. So a key difference between the high density and the medium density residential zone is a greater setback requirement for outlook from principal living rooms, or what you would normally think of as your living room area. So it doesn't seem like a big difference, but it does have a big difference in terms of how much density can be achieved on the site. And perhaps the 2 standards there that I've highlighted around outdoor living space and minimum unit size, I've highlighted those because it is relevant to the next slide, if we perhaps click to that, which is really about what we know is coming down the pipeline from central government later this year and into next year. So I'm sure you will have heard about this. The government has signalled some reasonably significant changes are coming down next year to the RMA, but also key pieces of national direction. So that includes the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which is really the key driver for what we're talking about today. But there's a range of other changes which the government will be consulting on from, I believe it's December this year, and they're intended to be in place by the middle of next year, which also coincides with the hearing time for the proposed plan. So it's just something to be aware of. The 2 things that are particularly relevant, and we don't know whether it will be included or not, is the government has signalled that they will remove the ability of plans to set rules for balcony or outdoor living spaces, and it will do the same for minimum unit sizes as well. Whether that actually makes its way into the final changes, we don't know, but it's just something to bear in mind. So what we're talking about today may need to be altered depending on where things get to with that.
Also to note that if a developer wants to provide for balcony, they can, but there's not going to be rules that makes them do that. It's like the car parking requirements. We had to remove the car parking requirements, but the developer, if they see a need or they think that it's going to probably have a better return, they can provide for car parking, they can provide for balcony.
Yeah. The other matter that may be relevant, depending on what form it takes, is potentially in the MPS, the changes to the MPSUD, the government signalled that they will include more directive requirements for enabling a mix of uses within certain zones. So that might be the mixed use zone, or it could even be the high density residential zone. We're not sure yet, but that might be something we need to look at once we have more certainty around what this direction contains. So then just moving through to the submissions. So there were many submissions received on the high and medium density residential zone. So I've got the numbers up there for you. A range of issues were raised, which I'll talk through on the next slide. But in terms of the range of submitters, it was quite mixed, as you would expect. So a lot of submissions from individuals within the community, a lot from developers, and government organisations is always a key one to these processes, like Waka Kotahi and Ministry of Education and that sort of thing as well. And yeah, just to note there, that doesn't include the submissions we received on the rezoning or the general residential zone. So there were quite a few on those as well. So then just turning to the key issues, I think it's fair to say most of the issues, and Lily, you can jump in here if you'd like, most of the issues were really raising concerns about the level of change and the heights and densities that were proposed in the high and medium residential zones, and that's pretty consistent with what we see around New Zealand with these sorts of processes. And the concerns relate to things like the limitations of infrastructure capacity, the impacts on amenity values, loss of sunlight, shading, and those sorts of things. Heritage was also a key one that came up. In response to those issues, a lot of the submissions were simply requesting that we go back to what the plan provides for now, or ideas like just applying the high and medium density zone to greenfield areas only, or reducing the heights and reducing the reception planes and that sort of thing. Lots of submissions received on the high density zones in Napier South and Taradale, as you might expect, raising those sorts of issues. Two other key things that were raised was the threshold for design assessment and notification. So in the notified plan, only one residential unit is permitted per site, and any more than that needs to go through a consenting process to consider design-related matters. I think that is something that needs to be looked at. It's not quite on par with the level of development that's permitted in other Tier 2 cities around New Zealand. So that is something to look at. But in terms of the other matter there around the fencing rules was really a key issue that came up. I'm not quite sure where that came from, but yeah, there was a lot of concern around the changes that were proposed there to the lower heights that are required and the permeability and that sort of thing. And we can certainly look at that, but what is proposed in the notified plan is quite standard and quite consistent with what we see around New Zealand. But yeah, we can certainly look into some of those matters that were raised around privacy and I think dogs and that sort of thing. So just so you know. Right. So in terms of, before we get into some of the detail, I thought it would be useful just to take you through our thinking at this stage on the overall response and some of the options that we think are available to address some of those issues. So at this early stage, the thinking is that broadly, in response to the issues raised, to generally retain the high density and the medium density residential zone. Really on the basis that intensification is a key component of...
Sorry, we've just got someone in the waiting room. Is someone,
Oh,
yeah, Paulina's got that. Sorry to interrupt.
oh, that's all right. Thank you. And that's really on the basis that intensification is really a key component of Napier's growth strategy, and that has been reinforced through several processes, Napier spatial picture, the structure plans, and I know we're only partway through it, but the future development strategy too. And I think that reflects that there is high demand for residential over the next 30 years, and there really are quite limited, and the FDS has really highlighted this, there are reasonably limited greenfield options available in Napier.
But we think that there is certainly the ability to fine tune some of the boundaries to those zones in response to some of the issues raised through submissions. And we'll talk through this a little bit more. And we think that there is scope to moderate some of the heights and densities, particularly in the high density residential zone, which is where I think a lot of the concern from the community is stemming from. But when we are looking at options to moderate those heights and densities, it will be really important to ensure that we continue enabling high density, but that we're really better targeting it to enable a more gradual transition over time, and better respond to and respect existing site conditions. But in terms of the medium density residential zone, the thinking would be to generally retain that approach to the level of development that's enabled, with a few tweaks here and there. The heritage interface is an issue that did come up quite strongly in submissions, and we do think that there are some options there to look at, particularly with a high density residential zone. So then if we move through to the high density, very quickly, just recapping what we're trying to achieve. These are the objectives of the zone. It's really about making sure we're using land efficiently in those really accessible locations. And I think good quality living environments is really the other key objective of that zone. So these are just important to keep in mind as we talk through the detail.
Yeah, and to add to that as well, we look at so much wider than actually the planning component. We look about affordability as well for our communities. Like if we're gonna intensify that, make better use of the investment that you're gonna have to do in infrastructure, it better prepare the city for resilience in the future. Like if you're gonna fight the coast and natural hazards, it's so much easier to contain that growth in a certain area rather than try to protect and expand through the sites. Like it make it so much more affordable from that point of view as well. So intensification is a very viable option for Napier.
Just a question around the good quality living environments. If the government keeps changing the rules, how do we keep influencing better outcomes in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's really what Paulina just said. It's not just about the rules that are in the plan. And to a certain extent, your hands will be tied by what the government is directing. But even if they take out some of those amenity type controls, like minimum unit sizes and outdoor living space, there are other things that the council can do. Things like, I know Hastings has their intensification design guide, and there are some design guides that Napier has as well. There's, working more directly with developers to encourage better on-site amenity outcomes. It's hard, it's more in the encouraging space, but there are things that council can do to better equip the development sector to deliver good outcomes.
And also together with that is working across the council as well, working with our parks and reserve teams and our community strategies team, because if you're gonna take out what we think is good amenity for those residential through the rules, then why don't we invest a little bit more in our reserves and make it more accessible? So when we are looking at intensifying, we always look the proximity to those amenities, and therefore it doesn't really matter if you live in a small space, because you can go out and have an enjoyable walk in the Marine Parade or on the drains across the city. So we're very lucky in Napier in terms of having a lot of green space where you can recreate, and it doesn't have to be in the comfort of your own home. We will provide those opportunities to do that, and investing in our CBD. All those projects make it attractive is what kind of compensates that lack of amenity in your house.
Yeah, so taking those points into consideration, I think we have to be really mindful that if we get an opportunity to submit to government proposals, that we bring up the consequence of their decisions transferring cost and obligation Because at the moment, cost and obligation sit with the developer to put good amenities in. If the government moves that away, they're shifting that burden onto the rate
Yes.
player. And I think we have to be really clear about that burden.
Yes, that's a good point. Thank you. Next one.
Small doesn't mean less low quality.
So, and I should probably have put draft options here, because these are really draft options to discuss discuss with you and consider. So going back to this idea of moderating the heights and densities in the high density zone, there's a few options we think available to achieve that. So the first one would be to reduce the height, the 19.5 metre height, and that would be quite simple, but it would be quite restrictive, we think. The second option, which some other cities have adopted, is only enabling 6 stories or 19.5 metres on larger sites. So sites that are greater than 1,000 square metres and say with a frontage of 24 metres. And the thinking behind that is larger sites are better able to achieve good design outcomes at that height. You can get greater setbacks from neighbours, and you can internalise the effects of that greater height. It is a little bit complex though in terms of how it's drafted and implemented, and it can create some challenges for the consenting team. So the third option that we think gets around some of those complexities but still achieves the same outcome is retaining the 19.5 metre or 6-storey height, but reducing the recession planes down from what was notified, and increasing the side yard requirements. And I've got some design testing shortly which will show you the outcome of that. But in summary, it's a simple and flexible approach, and what it will mean in practice is that that 19.5 metre height could really only be achieved on larger sites. On smaller sites, you're more likely to get 3 to 4 stories, just given the feasibility characteristics of apartment development. And those increased side yards allow more space for things like landscaping and just general separation from neighbours. So then to the design testing. So the first thing we did was just look at what some of the typical site sizes are. So we took a couple of blocks in the high density zone. So the first one's in Napier South. And you might recall that the site at the south, that's that new where the Peter Pit and that, I think it's Anytime Fitness, isn't it, Lily? Yeah, where that Anytime Fitness is. So it's not really a residential use, but all the other sites are around about 13 metres wide, and that's pretty typical. And then the next example that we've got, if we click to the next slide, is in Taradale. So this is just to the south of Taradale Park, and it's just immediately to the west of the centre. It's quite unusual. The sites in this block are quite large. The frontages are around about 20 metres, which is pretty generous, really, when you think about it. But a lot of these are cross-leased too, so that's just something to bear in mind, which would actually be quite a limiting factor, I would say. So then what we've done is done a couple of tests on different site widths just to see how these different recession planes what the outcome would be. So on that first example that I gave you, that 13 metre wide site, on the left here is what was notified. So that's the 12 metre and 60 degree with recession plane with a 1 metre side yard. You can see there that on that site you can comfortably get 4 stories. You might even get a 5th story as well. Although it would be pretty constraining there on a site of that size. With a reduced recession plane, and we're thinking at this stage around about 8 metres and 60 degrees, which is consistent with similar sorts of zones around New Zealand, and a 2 metre yard setback, you could potentially get to 4 stories but you'll see the impact of that lower recession plane is really pushing the building bulk to the centre of the site. And then 4 stories, it's probably more likely to be 3 stories than 4 stories. 4 stories is quite an unusual height. I know there are some examples around in Napier, more in your mixed use areas, but it probably would result in more 3 to 4 story development. So if you click to the next slide, so this is just one development example, and it's always difficult to find examples, and there's never the perfect one. But this is from Auckland, and this is in their what they call their terraced housing and apartment building zone. And it's around about a 14-metre site, and the important thing is this is that 8-metre and 60-degree recession plane. So you can see on a site of that width with an 8-metre and 60-degree recession plane, you're getting about three stories. I think that the downside to this development, I mean, it's pretty mid-range, but there's not a lot of landscaping. So I think that does actually make quite a significant difference to medium density development, and that really reflects the rules of this particular zone. But that lack of landscaping is something that we're wanting to address in response to submissions, both within the front yard, but really making sure that what's happening in those side yards, there is some provision for landscaping and screening to neighbours as well. So then going through to that slightly wider site, 18 metres, which is probably more aligned with that Taradale block example that I showed you. Under the left, under the notified, you're easily getting 6 stories on this size site. But under a reduced recession plane, it's just pared back a bit. So again, it's limiting it to around about 4 stories. You could maybe get a 5th story. It might be a bit challenging, but you could. But again, you're just really you're really pushing the building bulk to the centre of the site, and you've just got more space to the neighbours to provide landscaping and generally better integrate with what's happening at those boundaries. So I've got a couple of examples here. This first one is a very high-spec, high-end development. Again, it's in Auckland in that FAB, in the terraced housing and apartment building zone. So it really shows you what an impact that site frontage makes. So you really do go from 3 stories to comfortably getting 5 stories on a site, but you can see that you can get a better quality frontage to the street, while also potentially managing those effects a little bit better to neighbouring sites. So you can see in this example here that 5th story is set back from the boundary. But I acknowledge that that's a really high-end example, and in reality there'll be a range of outcomes that will be delivered under these rules. So then a more local example that we've included here, and I know this has been, there has been quite a bit of coverage about this particular development in Wellesley Road. We did a check to see how the rules that we are suggesting might stack up against this particular development. So this site has a 15-metre frontage, it's 23 metres wide, 3 stories. It would comply with that 8-metre and 60-degree recession plane, and from my review of the plans, it would also comply with that 2-metre yard. But what I would say, having had a good look around the development, is while it's nearly complete, it's not quite complete, and there's still quite a way to go in terms of the landscaping and all of those finishing touches, if you like, which will ensure that it is better integrated with some of the neighbouring sites. Oh, yes.
Thank you. Sort of thinking out loud, but quite seriously, how do we have rules or tools to enable and get people to do the landscaping stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Cool. So that won't be missed out in any way, like people just can't not do it? Because that would be horrendous. Yeah.
I agree. The landscaping is very important.
Yeah, especially if you're widening those side zones. Yeah, it just would be horrendous.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of the challenge with, and perhaps some of the coverage of this particular site is it's not quite complete yet. So there'll be a landscaping plan which would have been prepared in support of this development, and that landscaping will go in once they've completed the building, and that will need to be put in as part of the consent. It'll be a condition of that consent, but it does take a while to grow, and that's the other thing that we see in other cities is it takes a while for that landscaping to look like that.
Just a question about that. The actual building is set much closer to the footpath than that. I mean, that just gives an impression that there's quite a big space between the footpath and the building. But when I walk past every day, it's right there. Is that visually a little bit deceptive?
It does look quite
I know,
different
doesn't
in
it?
real life. And I think, and part of it, I think, is perhaps that the landscaping that's shown on the front, which appears to be within the road. And what I haven't done is check the plans to see if there's any reinstatement landscaping that's required as part of it. I would say that there is if it's shown in this render, but yes, it's just not complete yet, so it's sort of hard to draw conclusions to that final product, I think.
Can I just add to the landscaping discussion? One of the challenges we have in the consenting space is developers don't necessarily see the value in its requirement to have a landscape architect prepare these plans, and they often try and prepare plans themselves and to save money, I guess, but some of the plants that they put in are not conducive to growing in our conditions, or they don't give the right effect. And so that's always a battle at the consenting stage with developers, and we have a lot of challenges with that, and that the plants really do have to be suitable to condition to be able to thrive and to achieve the amenity that has been set out.
Do we have a design guide for them for that sort of stuff? Was there one available?
We refer them to the Auckland Design Guide,
Okay.
Which is a sort of a standard model of council.
Okay.
But we obviously can't, it's not prescriptive, it's still their choice ultimately in terms of what types of plants and we can't.
To have a landscape architect to design it, but there has been a very push strongly back on that, and that's been quite hard to compel them to have that done. So.
Can I just, following up on that question, just acknowledging that sort of operational constraint the team are finding at the moment, is there an opportunity to include in your recommendations something around the requirement to have a landscape architect involved in the landscaping to be sort of one of the matters of consideration inside the rule?
I think there's potential to really strengthen those landscaping requirements. It would be a little bit challenging to say that it must be prepared by a landscape architect, but we can do things like be a bit more detailed around the outcome that we're trying to achieve and making sure that any landscaping provided is suitable to local conditions and addresses some of the points that Rachel raised. And in order to address that through a consenting process, you are going to need a landscape architect to give advice on that. So I think there's definitely the opportunity to be more detailed and address some of those operational issues for sure.
Yeah, I think my feedback hearing what Rachel's saying there is that everything we can do within the role to compel people to take that part of their compliance with the application process for landscape architects seriously enough that they employ someone to do it, compel them without compelling them essentially is worthwhile.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this development is a good example of the importance of landscaping and how it can integrate, how it can be an aid to integrating and perhaps softening the built form. Because
I think it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you see this example here, I think that what make it, one of the things that make it so appealing is those high trees. High trees right there. I know that our infrastructure team probably doesn't feel the same about trees because they get into pipes. But having a little bit of the scale of the tree gives so much softening to the scale of the building. And yeah, I think that is a very important thing from a amenity point of view. And we tend to not like trees because of the problem that can have with roots. So we always need to think about the right species as well.
They also provide us with oxygen.
Nice for retirement windows are quite good, really, because they've got a double dose of trees.
Yeah.
Okay, so then this is the last example that we've got. And it shows you on a 26-metre wide site, or, you know, this is, you don't get too many 26-metre wide sites. So this is really a situation where someone's amalgamating two sites together, which is what these sorts of rules do really encourage, because it shows that you can comfortably and easily achieve 6 stories with a wider site. And you've got plenty of room to play with in terms of landscaping, vehicle parking if that's proposed, outdoor living space and that sort of thing. As the sites get smaller, it just gets more challenging to fit all of those things in a way that achieves a quality design outcome. So adjoining.
Sorry, we've got a question from Hayley.
Yes.
Hi. Just if you flick back to the one around the 13-metre wide site.
13, sorry.
Just a question
That one?
about, the next one back. Or
Two back,
okay.
yeah.
And one more, and one more.
One
That's
more
two
that
more.
this way. Oh, the other,
No,
sorry.
this one.
I means you.
Go
Yes, you.
back.
One more?
Keep going, 13-metre.
Yeah. That one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just looking at that and wondering about the problem we're trying to solve. So is it about height, or is it number of people, or, because I look at that and I think that's almost sad, because do you get a lot less people in the second one? Am I reading that correctly?
It's less intensive.
It's less intensive,
It
and
is.
that's what we're
Yeah.
trying to combat, and trying to achieve. But is it, from a neighbour's perspective, you've still got a 4-storied house beside you. Is it about the sun blocking your property, or is it about neighbours looking into your property? Because that doesn't solve that one. And so I suppose, what's the problem that we're solving in the feedback?
It's a little bit of both, because if you see the diagram on the left there, and don't forget as well, there's a range of other controls that are included within the zone. Like we have a maximum building length control, there's outlook standards and all sorts of other controls which will limit and guide what you can do on the site. But yes, if theoretically, if you were developing up to the full maximum potential under the diagram on the right, you would potentially have lesser intensity. So you would have a lesser degree of overlooking neighbours' sites. There would be a slightly greater setback from neighbouring sites, which would provide some opportunity to either locate your ground floor private outdoor living space on that side, and or provide some landscaping which would enable some screening to neighbouring sites as well. What the impact of this might be is under that example as well, you'll see you've got, you may only be able to get a single unit, if that makes sense, fronting the street, whereas under this example, you could potentially get 2 units with a central access way. It doesn't look like much of a difference, but in reality, I think the difference would be quite, could potentially be quite significant. And the lower height to boundary really just gives you a bit more room to play with on those smaller sites to visually integrate with those neighbouring sites.
And more lighting as well, less shading to the.
Potentially, yeah. If under this example you could get a 5th story, but you really couldn't get a 5th story under a reduced height to boundary.
And the benefit of the 2 metre yard setback, is it so you can get a driveway down or just landscaping or?
It would be a little bit of both. So in reality, with these sorts of sites, what you do tend to see a lot of is you might have a single unit fronting the street, and then you might have a couple of terraces behind it. Is quite a common form of development. So generally, you would have a driveway on one side, and there might be that outdoor living space on the other side. So under that scenario, that would comply with those 2 metre yard requirements, but it also just gives a bit more space as well for some landscaping within those side yards as well, compared to a 1 metre yard.
Would the market not drive a lot of that anyway?
Potentially, yep.
Yeah, I suppose I'm wondering, what are we achieving by being more restrictive? Is it certainty for neighbours?
It's really just trying to achieve a bit of a balance, I think, and a more moderate transition from what's there now, which is, pretty low density, to more medium and higher density forms of housing. But that's certainly an option. It's in the notified plan, which is really the go for it option, if I can put it that way. But it will be quite a significant degree of visual change for communities.
And it shows that you're, sorry, I just wanted to add as well, you are responding to your submissions on the plan as well. Remember that come from the community, and we're trying to accommodate those views to the best that we can.
Sally? Thank you. Yeah, I like the approach of trying to accommodate views, so appreciate the work that's been done. But just so I've got this very clear in my mind. So we have a regulatory tool that tells us there's got to be a level of landscaping because it's part of the consent, but we've got nothing for parking.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yes.
That is cray. So that even more makes me think about like having a further setback to create that space if people wanted to, because in the world that we live in right now, there is a need for car. Perhaps not in the future when we have a better public transport system, but that's another reason to consider probably more space around the building. Practical purposes.
That's a good point.
Annette, did you have?
Do you believe?
I've lost it now. I'm thinking about Sally's thoughts, and I think it comes down to where we've also put our high density zones. So we've tried to put those in the most practical, right? Thinking back to our initial, guidance on this, trying to put them in the most practical places to then enable access to public transport and other amenities nearby. Like you look at that Wellesley Road one, it's perfect. You work in the CBD or within walking distance, healthcare, supermarket, whatever. And that's been the intention. So I'm less firm that we need to make it smaller than bigger, personally, because I think we have already identified the areas in which higher density is most appropriate. And I think if you were to compromise on that up front, as opposed to, say, having it be a recommendation that might come out after hearing submissions in full, then you leave the chance for that to be diluted further, and then we don't achieve in our high density zone what we're trying to achieve. So I'm not firm on needing to reduce it. And just to the point around parking and landscaping as well, I think, we could have national direction tomorrow that no housing space in residential zones should be left for landscaping, just like what we've had for parking, which would override whatever we had in our district plan. So we are kind of at the mercy of when some of that national direction comes out. And whilst I agree, I don't think it's practical in a city like Napier to have no parking ever. If there is a place to do it, it's in these areas we've designated.
I get what you're saying, but just for the world that we live in right now, based on the feedback that we've gotten from our community, not considering something like this, I think would be foolish for us.
Developers can still put car parking in place.
Yeah.
Oh, I know, yeah, I understand, but they need the space to
Yeah.
have the car parking.
Mm.
So I understand that you probably can't plan for all eventualities, like I get that as well, but I think it's a case of trying to, as often as possible, have your cake and eat it too, by using the tools that you have available to you, so.
I think I'm still sort of leaning towards being more enabling and letting the market decide to a lot, because like if you look at Ahuriri, the new apartments that have gone in there, they don't have gardens per se. There's a bit of landscaping and stuff at the front, but part of the appeal of living in an apartment is that you don't have to mow lawns. And if we essentially force them to have an area that's landscaped, then you're forcing something on them that's almost counter to why you would want to live in something like this. I mean, I assume they'll have a body corp and all of that, but that's just another expense to put on them. And so I feel like the market is probably quite well placed to decide whether parking is appropriate in that area, or, you know, whether you do want a driveway or a driveway doesn't work. So, and like just having been to Wellington and seeing like up on the hill in Wadestown, lots of people don't have any access drive on street, and going to Tokyo and there's just like tiny houses and millions of people, and it's just works and it's efficient. And I don't know,
I think the point Rachel's making is that this could potentially just be a transition to actually take on board the feedback that we've got from our community and the resistance to change, which we all know is natural human behaviour. So actually smoothing that transition and introducing this, but there's nothing stopping you from changing that at some point in the future. So,
And to add,
another view. Fleur has her hand raised.
yes,
I do. Thank you. Sorry, the voice from yonder. Some of the concerns that were raised through submissions, particularly for the high density residential zone, was also in relation to our capacity within our infrastructure network, particularly stormwater. And the district plan, proposed district plan as it currently has, requires stormwater to be attenuated on site for any new development. That typically requires some space to be available for that attenuation to occur. And so the recommended option to provide greater setbacks within these zones would provide for more space and also less building footprint, which would capture the stormwater, obviously, and the availability of more landscaping area, which is obviously more permeable. So I think there's a number of factors that we have to kind of weigh up that was raised through submissions, and also how we can best address those issues that these areas face.
Thanks, Fleur. That's really helpful. Juliet.
Yeah, if you have a bigger setback, you've just got a more visually pleasing kind of setup rather than living in a concrete jungle. I don't know if I'd like Napier to turn into Tokyo.
Yeah, no.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're only missing a few million.
Yeah.
Right, any more questions before we move on to the next?
Okay,
Thank you.
keep going. This is actually this is the last slide before we end on some questions for you guys. So it's good timing. So this was just a point of discussion around the high density zone where it adjoins the heritage overlays or heritage items. And Fleur, please jump in if and where appropriate. So you'll see on the plans up here, we've got the Napier South and the Mariwa heritage areas adjoining the high density residential zone. And currently we don't have, in the notified plan, there isn't a clear control around how that interface is managed between potentially a 6-story building and a much lower scale heritage item. So that is a relevant matter that's been raised through submissions. We haven't quite got to an option yet, but it's really just to flag to you today that we're aware of the issue. We're working on that issue with Council's heritage experts, and there's a couple of options that we think that could manage that. So we could either again look at perhaps a reduced height or recession plane on that where it adjoins. That would require a bit of analysis looking at the particular heritage values in relation to those adjoining sites to understand what that limit should be. Another option that we're looking at is in the knowledge that multi-unit development needs a consent anyway, perhaps including some more design guidance and criteria for that interface and what that should look like. So that's just something that we're working through with the heritage experts at the moment, and we will come back to you once we've made a bit more progress on that. Anything to add to that, Fleur?
No, I think you said that perfectly.
Ah, great. So then just before we get into the medium density zone, and just so you know as well, there's not a lot on the medium density zone. It's really the high density zone that's the key one to discuss today. In terms of direction, we've just got a few questions up here for you just to help guide the discussion, and then around the direction that we're really looking for. So do you support retaining the high density zone? And I think I'm hearing that is a yes, but do correct me if I'm wrong. Amendments to the high density zone to reduce those recession planes and increase yard requirements. It sounds as though there's a range of views on that. And then just that item around the heritage interface, we're keen for your direction on.
Okay. I think the first one, as you're right, there seems to be a consensus of retaining the high density. Any discussion or views on the amendments to those recession planes and increased yard requirements? So just trying to get straight in my mind, these would be, because we've still got the hearings committee process. So are these amendments that happen before it goes to?
Yes, correct.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
So this is for us to go and draft the Section 42 report.
Right. Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
And just to clarify that process for you, so these would be changes that the reporting planners would still need to work on it more, but would essentially be recommending
to the hearings
panel. So the hearings panel still need to consider the notified, and what the council planners are now recommending, and as well as what the submitters are asking for. So the submitters might be asking for more, they might be asking for much less, and then between those three things, they'll make a decision on, or recommendation on which to go with.
Open up for views on.
I suppose with my councillor hat on, not the commission one, because it might feel really different then, but I suppose I'm quite keen to be more enabling. I think that the second lot that you said with the bigger lot sizes, that felt like it was addressing a problem more. I felt like that on that 13-metre section, it felt like the same effects, but less of the benefit, if that makes sense. So, yeah, I don't know, I suppose I'd lean more towards the enabling Liberal side on our rules.
Julia?
No, I'll just be the opposite and lean towards having a bigger setback. So I think this is going to be a 50-50 thing, yeah.
Yeah. And I think just bearing in mind what Fleur said as well, I think we need to consider that around those stormwater sort of factors in it, and the fact that the reduction of recession planes, etc., would assist with that. I mean, I'm quite torn because, like you, Hayley, I'd like to be as enabling as possible, but then I'm also cognizant of if we've had all this feedback from our community, and we've heard from Fleur in terms of some other benefits of taking on board these amendments, then, yeah.
See, I heard the opposite from Flo. I heard that that developers were going to have to put in a certain amount of permeable ground. So they would naturally, we don't need to say exactly where they have to have the permeable ground. It would drive those positive outcomes anyway.
You're assuming. it's
You can look at it that
Is it-
way, but
Is it permeable ground or ability to collect?
Attenuation.
yeah, attenuation, the ability to collect. So I think that play was more meaning that if you have smaller unit in the same area, then you would allow for that stormwater. But I think that you're right as well, because if you have that requirement, the stormwater retention is a requirement, you would need that place.
Yeah.
So the developer would design it according to meet that requirement. So eventually it might be developed by design, which
Yeah.
would use less of the site as well.
Modern technology, you might put your collection under the ground,
Yeah, true.
or at ground level, or it could be your fences. So it doesn't necessarily have to take up
The
a whole
space,
heap
yeah.
of space.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the other thing to note as well is that despite that we want to be very enabling, and I completely, that's the way that we present it to you, and we have been always quite supportive of that, really, the most enabling that we can be. Even if you put a few of the parameters, the constraints, like going with a more conservative approach, a developer can go through a resource consent and address all the issues. So that we're not saying no to that kind of development. It's just obviously has a hurdle, and developers don't like the resource consent process. But there is a way forward that is not completely not allowed. Yeah.
That makes me feel.
But it would be great to have a little bit of a direction from you today. I know that
Oh,
it's
you will give
tricky.
it to you.
We will get there. Procedural question around how you frame up this in your section 42A report. Are you required to give a recommendation, or could it be council's considered and is comfortable with some alternative approaches that could look like this, and then that could just form part of the deliberation process as part of those parties that are, obviously there'll be submissions in support, there'll be against. If you were to put it essentially as alternative options in your 42A report that might cover more than one option without giving a preference, it still leaves it up to the hearings panel to consider, and but they have all that information that council's comfortable essentially with a couple of alternative approaches.
Yes, we can do that. Yep.
Yeah, so we don't actually have to make a hard and fast today.
No, not at all. And I mean, there's still more work for us to do anyway to get to a point of a recommendation, and yeah, we can certainly put forward alternatives. The panel will ask for the planner's opinion on which is the best in section 32 terms, or the most efficient and effective option. So ideally, we would be able to point to a preferred option, but yeah, we can provide alternatives. Yep.
The other thing is that we haven't received the evidence, so we write the section 42 before we receive the evidence, and then we have the evidence, and we can change your position slightly.
Yeah, that through you, Mayor Wise, that was my consideration as well, is that you may very well find more targeted questions come from the panel after hearing and seeing all the evidence that's, in considering this factor, what is your preferred position? And that might, that's where we rely on your professional expertise at the hearing to be able to also have seen that evidence and present what might be a slightly different preferred position. So, I mean, my preference today is just to say I'm quite comfortable with it all being presented to the hearings panel. I don't think that's one I'm actually sitting on. I think that's one Councillor Brown sitting on. But so it is part of the consideration, but I don't think we need to give you a firm preferred position before evidence.
Yep.
And you're comfortable with that approach?
Yes, certainly. And I suppose the purpose of today was really getting a sense from you as a group if comfort level, I suppose, around the notified. And if there is a desire for change or significant change, I'm not hearing that today. So that gives us a little bit of flexibility to take that option-based approach and sort of keep things a little bit open.
Yeah.
If that's the preference.
Mayor-wise, I think all the points that, Councillor Gregg and Councillor Crown raised in support of reasons why you would have additional setbacks are very valid, and I suspect there'll be a lot of submitted evidence around that stuff as well. So I think your panel could quite easily land in that position, but it doesn't necessarily have to come as a preferred position in the 42A report.
Yep. That sounds awesome. I think probably what I'm struggling with is understanding what the process looks like, because I don't know what comes first, what comes second in regards to when it's going to be heard and what evidence needs to be. I don't know what the process looks like, so it's actually kind of difficult to provide guidance and direction when you don't know what the process looks like from here on in.
Yeah, I can
Is that
probably,
fair?
yeah, fair enough. And I can give you a little bit of
It'd be great to have it up there, you know, like for us to understand where we're at in the process, because I understand it's been a hell of a process so far anyway. So yeah, because I'm not a commissioner, I don't sit on this. Yeah, understanding the context is really important.
So obviously the submission have a recommendation. The submitters would have their own evidence when they make a submission. So that is something that we consider. We have to prepare those Section 42 reports during a longer period of time, but 20 days before the hearings, you have to notify that to the public. 20 working days before the hearing. And what happens then is that all the submitters read your recommendation, your plan of recommendation, and if it is favorable to them, sweet, they can not come to the hearing. But if it is something that they didn't expect, or the planners would say something that is not what they wanted, then they can gear up the evidence. They can go and do the research and put the effort, and that evidence need to be, technical evidence need to be provided 15 days before the hearing. So it's 20 days before the hearing, 15 days before the hearings, and then you have another time frame, which is your legal evidence. So your lawyers come in and provide further work, and that is 5 days before your hearing. So all of that, it's directed by the RMA, so it's quite a statutory time frame. All of that goes into the website. It's available for everybody, to the commissioners, to the submitters, and everybody. And then you have the opportunity at the hearing to talk about that. What happened as well is that, because the planners wouldn't have seen the technical evidence or the legal evidence either. So it cannot be new submission, or it cannot divest from the original submission. But what can happen is that the new evidence, the planner might consider that new evidence very relevant. So therefore, after the hearings, usually the commissioner would say to the planner, have you changed your views after the hearing and reading all this evidence? And you can say yes or no. So it's an iterative process. It's complex, but yeah, that's what so there's a few steps there.
Just in other cities, I've heard that the way that their planning worked was that when they went to more high density housing, or like higher buildings, they had rules that meant that there had to be a certain number of green spaces per high density, which meant that actually their medium density areas ended up having more people in it than their high. Have we got any, I don't know the details of that example. Is that a common thing?
Do you mean on-site green space, you mean, or?
Well, I think, the way I understood it was that it was like you need to have parks nearby or whatever, and so it really limited the amount of green space. And the amount of people that you could actually fit in because of
I've not heard of that before. I know that there are often requirements for, so for your larger developments in other cities, you'll look at what the open space provision is around the site to understand if you need to provide a neighbourhood park or something like that. But no, I'm not aware of that specific example. But yeah, it sounds interesting.
It is a consideration though, Hayley, when we did that spatial picture, one of the criteria to identify where we're gonna put that high density and medium density was the availability of those parks and reserves. So if they are available nearby, we obviously said it's okay to go high. It is one of the considerations. So definitely it's thought in advance of allowing for that density. Mm.
So would you, are we suggesting that we have the same approach for those interface with heritage item overlays areas? Or, because I'm probably a little bit more inclined to lean towards the recommendation that that is one that we look at options so that we can have a more sort of seamless transition into those, those streets and neighbourhoods.
That would definitely be my recommendation. Heritage is a matter of national importance under the RNA, and we do need to make sure that those heritage values are respected and responded to. Haven't quite nailed what that option looks like, but in my view, we should really look into that quite closely.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mayor Wise. I'm quite comfortable with our recommendation there. And I think it's not to say less significant, but it's less complex maybe than that first issue.
Yeah.
So I think, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Okie doke. And then just going through to the medium density zone there. Look, really to cut to the chase, if we flick to the next slide. The medium density zone standards, as I mentioned earlier, they enable development up to 3 stories. A range of housing types will be delivered within that envelope, if you want to call it that. So as I said, it will be small scale, infill, house at the back, duplex, 2 to 3 story terraces, and the notified standards are similar but are a little bit lower in scale than what you'd see in the tier 1 cities like Auckland and Wellington. So in that sense, while it does enable medium density, it does respond to the Napier context, particularly around the slightly different recession planes and outlook standards that apply. So our recommendation for the medium density zone is generally to retain the standards that were in the notified plan. There'll be a bit of tweaking around the edges in response to the submissions, but broadly retaining it. And seeking some direction from you on that today. Although based on the discussion from the high density zone, my sense is there may be some consensus around this, but over to you.
Anyone hugely against retaining what was notified?
Retain.
Okay.
Just a question on where they are. So the West Shore, have we, because I know that wasn't part of it. I noticed.
We're not part of them.
If you go
It's
back
the-
to slide 5, that's got
The
the
first one,
Yeah. My concern there is we're limiting it to 2 levels, because there is a little blue circle there. Do we know what that?
If you go to the next slide, Paulina.
Oh, the next one?
Yeah. Yeah.
I suppose what I'm thinking about there is we've been told by, God knows, someone that for a tsunami evacuation tower, basically what they need is a 3-story concrete building, and that's, I mean, at your own risk, but that's what they need. If we're limiting, that's one of our major, most vulnerable areas for a tsunami, and if we're limiting them to a 2-story, that feels uncomfortable. But on the flip side, that's also a coastal hazard erosion zone, and we don't want to increase the moral hazard of increasing development there.
Yeah.
So I get that it's a tricky balance, and I was just wondering if we'd thought about that space.
And look, I think that just going back to what's on the map there, the key driver for the location of the medium and high density zones has been that accessibility analysis that we started through the spatial picture and progressed through the structure plans. So West Shore under that accessibility analysis we did, didn't perform as strongly as the areas around the city centre and Taradale. So that's really the key reason why the medium density zone isn't applied there, although the natural hazards is, you know, a consideration there too. But yeah, it's very much the accessibility which is driving the zoning in that location. And in reality, you're asking to, if we enable that, you're actually asking more people to go into that area when already we know that it's vulnerable?
Well, yes and no, because I think we do have one 3-story property in there at the moment. And it's just like, it appears to be one rich person's house, if you know what I mean. Like, it's just a big house. Yeah, I suppose I just feel a little bit uncomfortable saying you can't build a building.
No, but you don't say you can't. You just, it's not enabled through the rule, but you can go through a resort consent.
Right, yes.
That's why you have a house there that is 3-story.
Yeah.
But it's different to, we're not saying you cannot do that.
Okay.
Yeah. You know what I mean?
Okay.
And it might be something like, in the knowledge that that is an issue in that particular area, you could include some matters for assessment, say where you're infringing height, that enables you to consider whether the purpose of the structure is to provide a safe evacuation route or something like that. So that could be a way around that issue without necessarily changing the zoning and the height.
So where would that fit in?
General residential zone. Yeah. In the general residential. Yeah. Yeah. But we'll note that down as something to pass on. Yeah. Yeah. So that can be, more enabling for that structure for the purpose of providing a respite to natural hazard in case of a tsunami. So we can look into that.
Yeah, so that just comes down through you, Miwa, sorry, to the classification, doesn't it? Is it, you can obviously apply for a consent for something that doesn't comply inside that zone, and then a matter for consideration when making that application is this purpose?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But through you, Madam Mayor, the consideration then though is the design standards. If you're designing a home and you're claiming it's for evacuation purposes, then it has a whole different set of design codes it needs to adhere to under the national guidelines.
I was just thinking about that, though. We don't want to step into that territory and then tell
But that's
people
the risk
they're
you
safe.
take. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Which, yeah. Yeah. And we're not going to get heaps of them because it's also an airport overlay, so you can't build too high there, and it's tricky, but I just feel like, balance.
That was, I think that was our last slide, actually. Yes. So that concludes the session today. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions?
No? Okay. And so the rezoning, that will be coming to us?
Yeah, that would come, and a workshop, probably, I would say that it would be early next year.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're preparing for the hearings on December as well.
Yeah.
But because of the impact this discussion has on several other in the general residential, we wanted to get your direction early.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Okay, we've got a bit of time to fill in till we have the police come to talk to us about the gang legislation. Hooray.
Was Terry into this?
She hasn't responded to me, which makes me wonder if she's having problems getting texts as well as phone calls.
I wonder if I can Teams her.
You too.
That's how the cool kids do it, isn't it? Do you guys Teams each other?
Oh, yes. Next generation.
Sure.
I'm just thinking while you guys are here. Don't one off, Nigel. It's going to be riveting. This next bit.
I'll drink this coffee instead of going.
Who else have we lost?
Richard's run out too. Shall I just wait, Casey? Hop onto the facilities.
Yeah, yeah.
He might just have decided.
Oh, the. Which one? Oh, is that, how come?
Do you see that, Kirsten?
Hmm?
That meeting's off tomorrow.
Yeah.
Why?
Thank you very much. This means I have to go to Matariki instead. Yay.
We've got a date for the workshop.
Well, that's good considering Manokanuk is off now.
Who's tuning?
Matariki. Yeah.
We have an independent chair
Oh, for the whole.
She is on her way.
Oh.
Teamsing worked.
Awesome.
I feel so young.
We're trying to sneak in local waters done well.
Yeah. Let's go.
And we thought, if you're really bored, we can do SDS too. So, look, just a real, while I'd got you all, I thought it'd be really good just to have a quick catch up on local waters done well. So you had the briefing last week with Andrew and the team, and I appreciate that at the moment there's a lot of detail in there, and we're trying to work through a balance of a lot of accountant speak, because it's mainly it's the financial modelling that's driving this piece of work. Versus making it understandable so you can articulate it to your community. So we're trying to find that balance. So just to give you a bit of wider context about what's happening. So there's two parallel pieces of work happening. We're doing our own numbers and then we're doing the regional numbers, which is being done through the RRA. What you heard last week was our numbers. What you're going to hear next week is the RRA regional numbers. And then at the next council meeting, what we'll be bringing to you is to ask whether, based on what you've heard today, you are still willing to progress to a business case. The business case doesn't commit us to anything, but it is really for the PwC team to take all of the numbers and add a bit more robust assessment over them and actually give us a bit more detail about what a multi-council CCO would look like. So that's all you're going to be asked for at the October meeting. If you say yes at that point, and Hastings also say yes, because if either Hastings or us pull out, we're done. If we both agree to progress, then at the next council meeting, what you will be being asked to do after another workshop is having all of the modelling around the business case for multi-council CCO, that you are willing to go out to consult with the community in the new year around the two options. Now, we've got to determine the two options, but I can be pretty frank with you in that the two options will only be multi-council CCO or single council CCO, because standalone really doesn't add up. Obviously, you need to make that decision, but that's what the numbers tell us. So that's kind of the process.
I'm wondering if this is being recorded.
Oh, I wonder if I can stop it at the front. Does it matter?
Not that it matters, because I think it's not being live streamed or anything.
And stand like what we're doing now.
Maybe not.